watching BloombergQuint. We come to you from the World Economic Forum's annual summit here in Davos. I have with me Adam Tooze, professor at Columbia University, noted historian as well as author. Professor Tooze, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Pleasure to be here.
I saw this morning a chart that The Economist magazine put out that said that only 22 of 167 countries have full democracy. And then in the chart, they've depicted the countries that have hybrid democracies and then flawed democracies. And it sort of resonated with me because a question that we've been asking in India, and I think many other countries have been asking as well, is democracy not working as well for the world? Or did we just misunderstand the way it was supposed to work?
I think you put that very well, and I like the way you put it better than the way The Economist put it. I think it's a question of how democracy works. We shouldn't think of it as a static thing. Democracy is above all a process, and it can have many different outcomes. And the democracies that we value and treasure and celebrate, including the Indian democracy, are not just characterized by the fact that hundreds of millions of people vote despite having low levels of literacy. It's that those democracies embody other values as well. The rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, a proud tradition of national liberation struggle, the defence of individual liberties, for instance. So it's always democracy in combination with something else. Democracy in and of itself, I think, is capable of producing incredibly ugly results because it simply can reflect the mass prejudice of whichever majority is empowered by its process. And so I think that's really what we are seeing is the realization of the highly problematic products of democratic politics in many cases.
Why does it seem that currently across the world democracy is producing results that don't sit comfortably with, let's say, some of our constitutional principles or things that we've come to believe as people?
Well, I think there's an issue of what previously was held in check. Many of these movements have about them an impatience, the desire to finally say something which for a long time they were somehow prevented from saying, finally acknowledging the essential Hindu-ness of the Indian nation, finally recognizing that the, politically correct norms of liberalism need to be overturned in America and people need to speak their minds. There's this impatient sense that, where something repressed needs to be articulated, and political entrepreneurs can make extraordinary political capital out of taking advantage of this kind of rhetoric, feeding in many cases off very genuine problems, failures of development, which are very significant in the Indian case still, huge inequality, which is a characteristic of many of the developed societies, the breakdown of hitherto expected futures in the sense of the white working class in America anticipating a kind of endless 1950s that is not the 21st century. And if you then combine those two things of structural problems with a dynamic political entrepreneurship that is willing to speak in these terms of releasing, as it were, the unspoken that needs to be finally brought out into the public realm, it's a very potent combination.
Does history inform us as to what happens from here on?
I mean, my sense is that there isn't a lot in history that tells us, for instance, about the trajectory of India. I mean, India is such a radical experiment. We've never seen a democracy like it. We've never seen... It's sui generis. In my mind, the search for analogues to understand the Chinas, the Indias, even search for analogues to understand the United States are in a sense beyond... That's, as it were, to read smaller history into a future which is very, very dramatic, gigantic in scale. We can clearly draw lessons from previous experiences about, say, the crucial significance of the independence of the judiciary as a key anchor, or the role of the independent media and the plurality of voices. Those are sort of simple principles, but I wouldn't be looking for any simple historical template. I mean, history can, as it were, expose to us things we shouldn't take for granted. We know the potential for violence that lurks in intercommunal strife in the Indian case, but it doesn't give me any clear prediction as to what happens next. It depends crucially on what actors do at this moment.
And this is all exacerbated by a leaderless world, because there is really no country or democracy now left to look up to, right? There was a time when, much of the developing world looked up at the UK or the US and said, those are the kind of institutions we want to build. That's the kind of country we want to build. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I find it hard to see that as a problem in and of itself. In a sense, the emancipation from, those simple norms, I think, is part of the slow evolution away from an imperial or colonial regime, and that's really to be celebrated. But that then opens up the possibility for various types of politics. Was always there. After all, it was the greatest excuse of British Empire in India, that the Brits needed to be there to prevent this kind of intercommunal strife, to which we know, of course, that Indian nationalism provided a whole string of serious, extremely sophisticated answers. And it's the failure to continue those that I think describes and characterises our current crisis. Likewise, in the American case, the founders provided a framework, but we have seen the way over the last 20 to 30 years extreme partisanship has torn away at that fabric and rendered what was always a complex design completely dysfunctional. So there is a need for reinvention. I really would shy away from saying we need new models, we need new leadership. I think it's really a call for everyone to take inspiration, and I remain, for that reason, a passionate European, because I think for all of its deficits, the EU is an effort to think a new type of politics. It is clearly flawed in many, many ways, but one of the more impressive speeches at this conference was Ursula von der Leyen's speech today. She's not perhaps the most charismatic speaker that you've ever heard, but she is articulating clearly the mission of the EU around the green agenda and the energy transition and the Green Deal. And that is, I think, the way democratic politics can be thought into the future.
One of the outcomes of the fallouts of a leaderless world is when you look at issues or problems or challenges on an international basis, for instance, climate change, you have no one set of people to lead that. And it is now left upon individual countries to do so by themselves, to try and come together in motley groups. The EU is attempting to do that under the aegis of the EU, but what about the rest of the world? So that's why I'm not suggesting that to go back to a world where we have a model to look up to, but the lack of leadership also means that certain important priorities and challenges don't get tackled the way they need to.
But I think this is why we need bargains. We need clubs exactly as you've described it, and it's clear, especially on the climate issue, ever since Copenhagen in 2009, that really this is a G4, G5 kind of a deal. It's the EU, China, India, the United States, and Japan as a potential fifth party to that deal, and that is the future of climate politics at a global level. Those key actors all need to be brought in. Obviously, the issue of climate justice has to be considered, which has been one of India's key contributions to global climate politics. But one of the things that one has to credit Modi's government with is taking responsibility on India's part for its contribution, which needs to be adjusted to India's capacities and its absolute imperative for economic development. But that is the future, I think, is those kind of coalitions. And the Europeans are very seriously working towards trying to build a coalition like that ahead of COP26 at Glasgow in November, which really will decide, I think, the future of global climate politics for the foreseeable future.
Professor Tooze, you've studied history, you've studied, economic crashes, financial crises. We're at the beginning of a new decade. What do you think will be the key things we should be looking out for in these next 10 years when it comes to deep changes in society, in politics, in economics, some of which we may have already discussed, but things that, I might not yet have asked you about?
Well, I do think the ongoing tech revolution, it's a complete cliche, but there's no doubt at all, I think, that transformation of all of our lives, the closeness, the interconnection, the fact that everyone in the world can watch your TV channel online, we're all part of these networks of communication, that is transformative. And it has, obviously, both a positive and a negative potential. And that is something that we're going to have politics about too. And again, the EU is a leading actor in that issue of data protection and the regulation of big tech as a key issue. So that's one of the frontiers. And it's also a frontier that enables many actors. Of course, one of the great Indian success stories is precisely in that space. So I think that's one zone. But it has huge ramifications potentially for the industrialization of large parts of Africa Africa, for instance, which may never get the chance to make the leaps onto the value chain that other countries were able to make in the 80s, 90s and so on. So I think that's a huge set of problems. The other one I do think is climate, because we're on a very, very short clock now. The actions need to be quite dramatic in the next 15 to 20 years. Not the world will not end otherwise, but the world that we will be living in, our children and their children will be living in, will be much tougher, much harder, especially, and there is no country again that is going to be worse affected than this, than India. And India's neighbourhood, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, are going to be in the absolute front line of the extreme weather that will come our way, the droughts, the lack of water. We've already seen this in southern India last year rather, in 2019. So that is a very dramatic reality that has to be grasped, and it really is a matter of the next 10 to 20 years.
And protests, we've been seeing them for the last 3 years, and they've become daily. There hasn't been a day I haven't opened a newspaper. I still do that sometimes, and that I haven't read about a protest, whether it's in India more recently in the past, or the Yellow Vest movement in France, or it is protests in the Middle East. These have come to become part of life. Maybe I'm just noticing them for the first time, and they were always part of history. But I'm wondering if that is something that we've come to live with and will for the next decade.
And I find it very hard to think of it as it's not a negative thing.
It isn't a negative.
It's a dynamic force. It requires interpretation. Obviously, it can provoke and bring out the very worst in a repressive state apparatus. Sometimes it's designed to do that. But on the whole, this is a mobilised population articulating interests, articulating arguments. It's got to be part of the process. I don't measure the success or failure of democracy by the level of protest. I would think of that as an integral part of a deep, flourishing democratic culture. I mean, I was on the great demonstrations against the Iraq War in 2003 and still hold that as a cherished memory of a powerful moment at which we didn't get our way. The UK still went to war in Iraq, but millions of people expressed their open opposition to a government which held us in contempt at that moment. And those sorts of things are anchoring for a democratic process. Even if you don't win, you at least make a public statement of what your position was, which then allows you to chain forward from there. So I think, all in all, this is something that we should welcome. You obviously would like to see it then also moving into the realm of active political participation, of electoral participation, of incorporation into institutions, not because that's the be-all and end-all, but because we have so far not come up with any better mechanism for articulating governance, but party competition within a constitutional framework. And that is, I think we're seeing, that is what I think where I see protest as a troubling sign, is when it's clearly an expression of the frustration of large numbers of people with those channels of communication. If it's articulated with them, backs them up, gives them instructions, if you like, helps to express what needs to be expressed, that's a different matter.
One final question. You've been watching the events unfold in India. What do you make of what the message that India is sending out to the world, or how the world is reading it?
Well, I think it's very much complicated, the way in which the world has to read the Indian message, insofar as I'm entitled to have, any voice in that. The whatever naivety we may have had about the significance of nationalism in the form that the BJP articulates it, I think has been stripped away. It is clear that this needs to be understood for what it is, namely a type of ethnic nationalism and religiously backed nationalism that in the Indian context has explosive implications. It's not for an outsider like myself to, as it were, adjudicate that one way or the other.
Sure.
But as a historian, it's evident that this touches on some of the most violent and difficult episodes in recent modern Indian history. And one worries, one is concerned for the sustainability of that project.
Professor Tooze, thank you so much for speaking with us.
That's a pleasure.
Always a pleasure speaking with you.
No,
and thank you for freezing it out
for
us.
it's good. It's fine.
That's it. Are you?